Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the most contentious recent divides we've seen in our country. We're talking about COVID. From the mask mandates to social distancing to the vaccine, countless relationships within churches, between families, friends, co-workers, institutions, and communities, these were all tested, and many of those relationships remain fractured. In this conversation, we're going to hear from two people who sat on opposite sides of the COVID divide and hear how their partnership today can guide us toward unity and healing. Dr. Francis Collins played a pivotal role in the COVID response as director of the National Institutes of Health, and Wilk Wilkinson is the host of Derate the Hate podcast. Thank you both for joining us today.
Nice to be with you, Walter.
Thank you, Walter. It's an honor.
Francis, I'm going to begin with you. You've been involved in many things over the years. You're a physician, a scientist. You led the Human Genome Project, which has been so instrumental in the discovery of genes and addressing multiple diseases. And then, of course, as I mentioned, you served as director of the National Institutes of Health. This is quite a list of accomplishments. But I want to turn not to the professional, but the personal. I'd love for our listeners to hear a little bit about your own story of coming to faith in Christ.
Well, most people assume that a scientist who's a Christian probably started out that way in childhood, found that faith was something that was going to anchor them for life and stuck with it. That was not my story. I did not have much of a faith upbringing at all. My parents were not denigrating of faith, but they did practice it. And so as I went off to college and listened to those arguments about do you believe in God or not, I decided I didn't. And by the time I was studying quantum mechanics in graduate school, I was an atheist. And then I went to medical school to try to take my interest in science more in the direction of the human body and human biology. And that forced me to face really serious questions about life and death, about whether God exists, about what happens after you die, about what's the meaning of life. I watched people around me facing the end of their lives and realized I was really unprepared for that. And I had a patient who one day just asked me a very straightforward question. After sharing her faith with me, she turned and said, "Doctor, you never really say anything when I'm talking about my faith. What do you believe?" And I realized I had no answer. I hadn't spent any real time looking at the reasons why faith might actually be a defensible position. I just assumed it wasn't. So I had about a 2-year journey ahead of me at that point to try to really understand, why do people believe this stuff? And bit by bit began to realize that my atheism was the least rational of the choices, because it represented basically claiming a universal negative, which scientists aren't supposed to do. And there are a lot of pointers to faith and to a creator in the science that I love so much, the Big Bang, the fine-tuning of the universe, the fact that mathematics works to describe matter and energy in beautiful ways. Wow. But I also wondered, okay, that might be fine for a creator who put it all in place and then went off to do something else. Does this God care about me? And the moral law ultimately appeared, and very nicely so in the writings of one C.S. Lewis, as an argument that we have something written in our hearts that calls us towards a holy God. It is this knowledge that there's something called good, and we're supposed to be leaning in the direction of that, even though we regularly fail. The regularly failing part then shook me up, because I thought, well, that means I'm hopelessly estranged from this holy God that I've just begun to realize is there. And then, Walter, you know what's coming next, the person of Jesus steps into that space, that gap between unholy me and holy God, and gives me that kind of opportunity to be forgiven. And I thought Jesus was a myth. I didn't know a thing about this. And when I discovered not only that the record of his life was incredibly strong, but that included his death on the cross and his resurrection. And that was not an easy one for a scientist to come around to, but I kind of figured out, wait a minute, the record for that is awfully strong too. Look at that wonderful book by N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God. All the evidence that's there, both biblical and extra biblical. But it also made sense. If God was the author of all that we see around us, if God put those laws in place, if God decided that those laws could be lifted to make an incredible statement that this is my son, and yes, he is in fact risen from the dead, who are we to say that's not appropriate? It's incredibly amazing. So I entered medical school as an atheist. I left as a Christian, and I've been a Christian ever since.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that part of your journey. And Wilk, I too want to hear about your faith. You share a faith, but I suspect your journey to that faith has been different. And Wilk, tell us of your own journey.
So my journey is definitely different than my friend Francis's. I grew up in a Christian household that we went through periods, ups and downs, where we were going to church, where we were going to Sunday school. I would say more not than going, but Christianity has always been a part of my upbringing. Going through periods where we prayed in front of every meal, going through periods where we only prayed in the beginning of a meal at holidays and during those gatherings. I had a lot of periods in my life where I was very agnostic to the idea of God and whether God, if there was a God, whether that God loved me or not. So it's been one of those ongoing battles in my life. But as I became older and as I became one of these people that really studied other people and really spent time trying to understand human nature and what human nature was and how we as human beings have to actually battle our human nature to be good people. The whole idea of a loving God and Jesus Christ dying for our sins and all of us as imperfect human beings trying to live a more perfect life and the importance of how all those things blend, it became very evident to me that it required more faith to not believe than to actually believe in a God. And in my case, to believe in Jesus Christ and the idea that God gave his son to wash away the sins of us imperfect human beings became one of these things that became of great importance to me. So yes, my journey to my faith is very different than Francis's. But one of the things that I say today is without my faith in Jesus Christ, without my ability to believe that there is a higher power and that there is something more than what we are just doing here on this earth, certainly plays a monumental role. So that's where I am in my faith today.
Wilk, thank you for that. There is this deep sense that you tap into of longing, this desire to be connected to things that make sense of our life experience. And I'm very compelled by the way that you've described it as it takes more faith, not to believe than to believe as you seek to make sense of the world. There have been a lot of things that have felt senseless in the last several years. Wilk, you have landed on such a compelling title to your podcast, Derate the Hate. That's probably the envy of many other podcasters that you would land on such a compelling title. Tell me a little bit about how you landed on that title and why.
So there's a couple reasons, actually. I have been in the transportation industry, Walter, for more than 25 years now. And one of the things about semi-trucks in particular and big diesel engines is the fact that there's a process by which they will try to save themselves. So, it's a design system, but when a semi engine or the powertrain system on a semi starts to derate, it's because something is happening within that system that can do immense amount of damage to that powertrain system. And so the idea of derate the hate is to turn down the hate. Well, also there's, in podcasting, in music production and things like that, the idea to derate is to turn something down. So, I just kind of took those two things, and the fact that I saw so much hate in the world today, so many divides that were not, the divides themselves were being exacerbated by certain, entities and certain people and whatever. And I thought, what if we could figure out a way to make as popular the idea of turning down the hate as so many have used to inflate themselves and keep us divided and work towards making the world worse. I thought, what if we can do something to make the world better? And so when I originally I was thinking about doing some kind of haters happy hour that I would kind of show people the different ugliness that was on the internet, and I thought, that's kind of ridiculous because they're already getting all the attention. Why would I try to give them more attention? So I'm throwing it around different word games, things that sounded good, and then I think one of my drivers probably called me at one point and said, my truck derated, now I can't do anything. And I thought, well, what if we derate the hate? Then they can't keep winning if we derate the hate. And I don't. That's kind of how I got there. And I love the way it flows. I love what it means, and then I love the work that I've been able to do with this podcast to derate the hate.
Oh, that's fantastic. Let me pull a little bit on some of your personal narratives before we jump into tackling this issue of COVID conversation. As I hear you, Francis, talk about your work, genomes, medical school, places where you've served, the NIH, I hear a very urban, cosmopolitan setting for your life. And Wilk, when I hear you talk about, shipping and trucks and the mechanics that you're describing, I hear a different segment of American society. And one of the divides that I've noticed, and this makes sense of my own personal upbringing, have been born in New York City and lived in kind of this immigrant community in New York City, but also having spent a very significant portion of my life in small town America and rural Pennsylvania. One of the divides that we are encountering is the divide between urban and rural areas and the respective economic impacts that unfolded during COVID, for instance, or cultural differences that exist between rural and urban. Is this my imagination, or are there actual differences? I mean, tell me a little bit about your backstory of urban versus rural upbringings.
Well, mine actually would surprise you because I started out very rural. I grew up on a farm that had no indoor plumbing. 98 acres. We raised sheep, cows, chickens. I didn't even go to school till the 6th grade because my parents thought they were better teachers than what the county school system had to offer in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and they were probably right. So it was a bit of a rather pastoral kind of upbringing, although it was also odd because my parents were academics. My dad was a college professor teaching drama. My mother was a playwright. They started a theater in a grove of oak trees up above our farmhouse, which is now in its 70th consecutive summer season. So it was this mix of a very rural environment, but a very academic kind of focused on theater and music upbringing, which was unusual, I suspect, for most of our neighbors. But I did learn hard work. Boy, yeah, plenty of that. and to appreciate, yeah, that life's tough in that environment. Things are always happening with storms and droughts and animals that are getting loose or dying when they weren't supposed to. Yeah, it's a whole nother perspective. But I kind of left that behind once I went off to college and then to medical school. And you're right. Since then, I've been largely in an urban environment, and I certainly am right now in Washington, D.C.
How about you, Wilk?
Yeah, so for me, my upbringing was primarily within small town Midwest USA, Northwest Iowa, Southeast South Dakota, a little bit in Minnesota, which is where I live now. But my parents, like many folks in the late '70s, early '80s, not college educated, working blue collar jobs, driving truck, construction. My mother worked in a sewing factory. No air conditioning. I mean, I remember my folks always had dirty and bandaged hands, and then very very little money, not having the luxuries that that a lot of people had, phone, television, things like that. So when I was growing up, I just I grew up looking around me and seeing other people not having things or having things that we didn't have. And then as the jobs would dry up in a particular area or something would happen, if Dad got laid off, then, we'd have to move to another town. And, so I'm in like 13 different schools before I even get to high school. And the friends that I had, I'd make a friend, and 2 months later we'd be off to another town or something like that. So it was a very, very blue collar lifestyle, very unlike those that I see from people that would be considered academic elites today. And I've never forgot my upbringing. Like I know Francis hasn't forgotten his. I know him and I have had many, many conversations about, the ways that we grew up and the similarities and the differences, because there are definitely, similarities and differences. And, but one thing that I was always grateful for, obviously, is the love of my parents and the fact that even if we were moving around and even if we were in a different town at the beginning of the school year than we were at the end of the school year than we were at the beginning, we always had each other. And while we didn't have a lot of material things, we had the love. So that was, it was interesting though, seeing how different classes of people were. And, so when I talk through things and like I said, I like to study people. One of the things that I see more than anything, especially today, is that class divide and how different classes of people seem to be. And while we have our differences, we should be focusing on our common humanity and what can really bring us together.
Yeah, I'm going to get to the common humanity part when we move this conversation forward, but I'm going to pick up on the difference right now and dive into the COVID conversation. Francis, you were charged in many ways with providing kind of this medical scientific response. What were some of your goals during COVID? And now that you've had some years to reflect, what do you come out of it learning?
Boy, that could be a long response. The COVID came along in the early days of 2020 in a way that was clearly going to change everything. We knew we were overdue for a pandemic. We thought it would probably be influenza, and yet it turns out to be a coronavirus. Within an hour after the sequence of the viral genome, its instruction book was posted on the internet on January 10th. NIH, and that was under my guidance, was pulling all the resources together that we could to try to see how could you develop a treatment for this, and how could you develop a vaccine? It was by God's good fortune that we already had a team in the Vaccine Research Center that had been working on mRNA vaccines for coronaviruses. They thought this might be something we would need for MERS, which was a different coronavirus in the Middle East. And so they already knew kind of what to do. And that first vaccine was developed in about 48 hours. And then had to be synthesized, had to be run through mouse models very quickly to be sure that it generated antibodies and didn't cause surprising side effects. And within 63 days, that was in a human being for a phase 1 trial. Just breathtakingly fast. That's usually something that would take you at least 6 months. And then on from there, the goal had to be to make that the number one priority. We had to find a way to protect people against this terrible scourge. And remember what it was like in March or April, May of 2020, just looking at those numbers every day as it went from dozens to hundreds to thousands of people dying every single day in our country alone, with the trucks pulled up outside the hospitals because the morgue couldn't handle all the dead bodies. It was tremendously exhausting, but motivating. I worked 100-hour weeks, I think, pretty much that entire year of 2020, as did almost everybody around me, trying to pull together every kind of partnership, knocking down the barriers that sometimes exist between government and industry and academia, and saying, this time we just got to do this together. Keep the lawyers out of the room, and let's just figure out what kind of science can be brought and who's got the skills to do it. And Operation Warp Speed came along, and that meant that there were funds available to do things at a speed that otherwise might have taken a long time. So it was all hands on deck, pedal to the metal, whatever you want to say the particular metaphor is, that we could not let a day go by where we made mistakes that might have saved somebody's life. That was what it was all about. I'm a doc, and looking back on this, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, I underemphasized the other consequences of what COVID-19 was doing to people in terms of the consequences of closures of businesses and schools. I was totally focused on how do we keep people from dying, because it was so horrendous to see what was happening. And the lessons we learned, well, there's so many of them. I'm sure we're going to come to that. And many of those lessons I've learned from talking to Wilk, who had this insight about what this pandemic was like in the real world. And I was not probably in what you might call the real world in the midst of the National Institutes of Health, trying to do all the science I could. But out there in the heartland, a lot of the things that were being recommended, mostly not by me. I had a rather small role in the public health recommendations, although I was at the table sometimes when those were being floated. Those were largely coming from CDC. And clearly, some of those recommendations were pretty tone deaf to what people were experiencing who were not in New York or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco.
Francis has alluded to this by saying, what the experience was in the heartland that was very different. So, Wilk, what was your experience in 2020 and of the pandemic? And with some distance, what are some of your reflections on that experience?
Right. So one of the things that, or a number of things that come to mind right away from the beginning of 2020 was, right away we just started seeing these news reports and seeing things on the radio of this thing is coming, we don't quite understand it, and we just know that we know that it has the potential to kill lots of people, and I remember hearing about the first reports of the when the first case was officially recognized that it landed on the the shores of the United States, and then we just were bombarded with fear stories over and over and over again within the media, and and all these people on this cruise ship have this, and then the biggest thing that's going on in Middle America is every store is running out of toilet paper, but anybody knows has this this coronavirus or this cold, and so we're hearing these nightmarish stories from the West Coast and the East Coast, and people are looking around, and we're like, what is going on? Because nobody around here has this thing, and nobody knows anybody who has this thing, and stores and restaurants are being closed, and people are being told they can't go to work, and people, there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of fear on the part of people that again had not experienced anything at this point, and so immediately within the Midwest and smaller communities, people started losing faith in what was actually happening because their favorite restaurant was closed. They couldn't go to, or the coffee shop that they would normally get their coffee, they couldn't get their coffee. But again, nothing had happened yet. Or I had conversations with people in even more rural areas than I'm in, and they're telling me, they're like I'm an ICU nurse in and I'm not gonna name the town, but in outstate Minnesota, that we've been closed for weeks, and nobody's coming to get their treatments, and things like that, and no, there's no cases of these things. So immediately I started wondering, like I do with most things, is why are we doing these one size fits all policies for rural America when these things right now are still primarily happening in either urban areas or the coastal large concentration areas, and it just, so that's one of the things for me was right off the bat was, we can't continue as a nation when the area demographics are vastly different in the way that we live our lives in say Clearwater, Minnesota versus even St. Paul, Minnesota, let alone Washington, D.C. and New York City and Los Angeles and San Francisco, so in speaking with people within my community and in closer areas, they're like, and then my office actually for my job was closer to the metro area, and like I said, so often we look at people from outstate Minnesota or rural areas versus the concentrated areas of your bigger cities. Like we can't keep doing these one size fits all things when we live different lives and do different things, and it just shows from my experience and from other conversations that I've had with other people, it's like they don't really respect what we have to say because our lived experience is very different than their lived experience, and so that's a lot of the stories and a lot of the feelings that people in the circles that I was speaking with and running with were feeling, and so it was tough. It was very tough.
Well, Wilk, you've described the differences in experience, and that makes a whole lot of sense in retrospect. In the real time, did the difference of experience lead folks to actually question the truth of what was going on in the coastal places? Or was it, hey, that's just a different experience, and we should have had a public policy approach that recognized the differences? But I'm curious to see, did it lead to this kind of dismissing the experiences of others? And then how do you process that?
Yeah, so absolutely, I think it did. I mean, there are still people out there that totally dismiss the reality of what was happening in some of those more urban, more concentrated areas, and like we do with so many things, Walter, our own lived experience, it gives us the lens by which we see, more, bigger pictures, and then we start to lose sight of how other people's lived experiences really work. So I would say, so many people in rural America will never experience or never know what it's like to live in an area in the middle of one of the 5 boroughs of New York City where the buildings, like maybe 1 or 2 buildings or complex, has the same number of people that the whole town that they live in has, and then they never go outside the, real borders of those little towns that they're in. So their lived experience, even trying to imagine what somebody in a, let's say, an elder community in a highly concentrated area where all of a sudden, people are passing away at a unheard of rate, and then they look at their town and they're like, nothing's happening. What's going on? All I know is I can't get, I can't live my life the same way that I was going to live my life. But then they also see, Walter, they go to their local Walmart and the Walmart's open, but the small mom and pop store that they would like to shop at isn't open. And they saw that thing and they're like, well, that's wrong. And now they're having to shop at Walmart, and Walmart's got arrows pointing one way down one aisle and another way down another aisle, and then somebody decides that they're going to go against that. One person's scared, one person's not. It starts a fight, and so now all the anger and the venom that's building up amongst people within their own town when real things aren't happening in their town, the only thing that they're seeing is the hate, the venom, the animosity, the just the angst building. And they're like, this isn't a problem that we should be dealing with. This is somewhere else. But then they start to question, why are these authorities making me do this? And why are those people constantly trying to scare my mother or my grandmother or, or my neighbor? And so it really did a lot of damage to the credibility. And yeah, people started questioning everything. They started questioning everything. And it really was to the detriment because, and there's still people, I think that number is dwindling, but there still are people out there that really question the whole thing. And if it happened, why it happened, if somebody's to blame for it happening. But I think a lot of that is the result of the distrust that was built because of the, short-sightedness in some of these policies and trying to do a one-size-fits-all thing when we really live in different environments.
Yeah.
Wilk, you alluded to, you kind of pointed out that the lived experiences that we have shape us deeply.
Totally.
But you also pointed out the possibility of having kind of an empathetic understanding of different communities, whether it's a rural community, understanding that, no, something really is happening. It might not be my experience, but there's something happening in New York or out in California. Why don't people give that space of understanding to each other? I mean, both of you know that hasn't happened. Francis, you and Dr. Fauci, you've been accused of all sorts of crimes against humanity even, and being viewed as an enemy. How do you even process that kind of venom being leveled against you?
That's one of the reasons I felt when I stepped down as NIH director, I had to understand better what had happened and how good, honorable people would end up being so polarized from each other because of a pandemic. How when we were being attacked by an evil force, the virus, somehow the way it played out, we began to think of each other if they were not part of our own bubble as part of the evil force. We slipped into that. And I didn't understand that. It was incredibly disheartening. And I certainly got and continue to get some pretty dramatic examples of that hate directed at me. So this is sort of how Wilk and I ended up meeting each other. So I decided I need to really have a chance to listen to people who have had this experience in a very different way than I have. I've imagined that experience, but I haven't actually witnessed it. And that was the motivation to join up with Braver Angels, which has as its very strong central focus bringing people together who have very different opinions about a topic. In our case, how was public health managed with COVID? But also they have other sessions that deal with things like gun control or immigration or abortion. But to do so in a fashion where people really do listen to each other. That's the requirement. It's kind of like marriage counseling for the country, where if you're really going to get somewhere, you have to listen so well that you can say back to the other person, here's what I heard you say, and here's how I think I understand your perspective. And most of the time we don't do that, do we? We get in a conversation with somebody who's on the other side of an issue, and while they're trying to make their case, we're planning our snappy response, and nothing good comes from that. Braver Angels takes it a different way. And so as part of that, I said to the leadership, I really need to understand the experience that people have had. And they, well, we've got plenty of people you can talk to. Let's start with this guy, Wilk. And I got to say, the first time we had a conversation, I was like bowled over by the strength of his arguments and by his clear distress at what the government had done and the things that had just gone so wrong and had done so much harm. Because it was hard not to feel defensive as a guy who was significantly involved in overseeing at least the science of the COVID response. But I had to listen. And then he kind of had to listen to me too, I guess. And I will say the first time we met Wilk, I thought, well, this is a good experience, but I'm never going to really feel like I'm comfortable with this guy because he is so completely in a different place than I am. And now I would say we're really good friends. And we still disagree rather strongly about several things about COVID and other things as well. But it's okay because we disagree without being disagreeable.
That's right.
Well, tell me about your journey into this friendship, the conversation, because you too have probably experienced people with venom toward you of like, oh, these people who don't mask or whatever are anti-science, they're anti-loving their neighbor. So venom goes in both directions, and I imagine you've had your fair share of that as well.
Oh, it most certainly does. I've seen a number of, whether they be emails or responses to things that I've said, and with this, like when you started this call, Walter, talking about this being one of the most contentious issues of our time, and that's one of the things that I continue to say because it's. The venom is not exclusive to one side or the other, and I've received it for my stances on masking. I've received it for my stances on vaccine mandates, and I'm not anti-vaccine at all, but I'm vehemently opposed to mandates. Same way with masking, things like that. But so there are people who I saw two ladies get into a fight in a fist fight in a Walmart because one walked past the other, and the one that didn't have a mask on, or the one that did have a mask on, told the one that didn't have a mask on that you're killing my family and you're a murderer and this and that, and so the idea that we go through this thing unscathed, no matter where we fall on the spectrum, is just not the case, because this is one of those things. And like I said, Walter, the part where you have people in the media, in politics, trying to use this thing to whether it's be gain notoriety or boost clicks or ratings or whatever the case may be, one of the ways that they do that is through fear, outrage, and grievance. That fear, outrage, and grievance builds angst among people of differing mindsets. what Francis said is so important there is, when we started to have these conversations, it's like we are two people who see this thing from an entirely different perspective. We come from a very different place on how it's going to affect us, or how it, at that time, how it was currently affecting us personally within our own lives, right? And it's hard to, it's hard to sit across the table, or in our case, especially at the beginning of this thing, sit on a Zoom call, one-on-one, face-to-face with somebody that played a part in, whether it be not the policies themselves necessarily, but the recommendations that maybe led to the policies that have now affected me and my life personally, right? The policies within the state of Minnesota that were dictated from on high in St. Paul directly affected me in my life, how I had to operate in my business, how my mother never really recovered from a fall that she had in 2019, because now she was secluded to my house, which is very small, and she never, she just still has not recovered. So, so with that being said, having those conversations on a contentious issue is very difficult. But when you step outside your own situation and step away from your own feelings and really look at the other person as the true and beautiful human being that they are, as another one of God's creatures, and
Amen.
really get to know that person on a personal level, and realize, that ascribing motives to the actions of others when we don't know what that person was doing is one of the greatest downfalls of man. And I'll go back to what I was saying before, fighting against our own human nature is often one of the hardest things that we'll ever do. But it's important to do it, because it's really where true growth happens.
Yeah.
We all share faith in Christ. And that faith has given hope, but it's also been a source of deep pain, honestly. And I think of conversations that I've had in the last several years in which I had friends tell me that they have had peer friends as well as family members question their salvation because of what they believed or did during the pandemic. It wasn't just question their sanity, or it was actually questioning, I'm not so sure that you're a Christian because of your choices here. That is ratcheting things up at a level that is really extraordinary and incredibly painful to hear someone tell you that. I'm not even sure you follow Jesus. What are the resources in faith that have been misused as these examples? And what are the hopes that you have as Christians for a different way forward?
Well, I do have hope. And yeah, Walter, you talk about that kind of extremely painful accusation coming from another Christian, basically saying, considering where you are on a topic, maybe it's vaccines, I think you're just a sham Christian. You can't really be a follower of Jesus and say what you just did. And just basically saying you're a fraud. I still get that. That just, I didn't see that one coming. I didn't see a lot of this coming, but I certainly didn't see that. I just was stunned, in fact, in this circumstance where people of faith were in many ways in the best possible position to try to stand against the divisiveness, against the lies that were being perpetrated in social media, of stuff that was just demonstrably false, of standing up for love. And that's what we're supposed to be all about. They'll know you are Christians by your love. But in many ways, faith communities were particularly vulnerable, I think, to other kinds of messages that spread fear and anger instead of reassurance, instead of love. And called as we are in this Sermon on the Mount to love your neighbor and also to love your enemies. I don't know that we've done very well. I'm speaking to myself as well here in that regard. And if we have a chance to try to turn this around, isn't it faith communities? And Walter, you're the head of the NAE and a great place to try to see whether we can turn that corner. Faith communities to kind of step back and say, now, wait a minute. This is not who we are. This is not who I am as a person of faith. I can be part of the solution. I can actually reach out to people who disagree with me profoundly and listen to them and pray for them and make myself vulnerable as well and admit that I don't have it all right either. But together with God's grace, we can find a path forward for healing of the many wounds that exist right now. That's my hopefulness. But boy, it has been a bit terrifying to see how much the faith communities have themselves been torn apart by this, just at the time where you hoped this would be a place of joyfulness, of truth, of peace. Psalm 46, God is my refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. God's there for us, but I don't know that the way we responded so often reflected that.
I have to echo the fact that so many people in this thing just lost sight of their own faith and started like I said, I'll say what I said earlier, ascribing motives to people who they know nothing about or nothing. I mean, they have not been in the situation that person is in, and then taking that to the level, Walter, of questioning somebody else's Christianity. This has been a problem of mine and a problem that I know many people that I've had conversations with over the years have with some Christians, and that's to say, because you are not doing what I think you should be doing, or because the way that you live your life does not comport with my idea of Christianity, that must mean that you are not a Christian. That goes back to looking at the world through the lens of my own experience, instead of trying to empathize with the idea that somebody else has a different lived experience than I do. To then say that you can't be a Christian because you are not going to take this vaccine that the media told me would save the lives of everybody in our neighborhood, so you must be a murderer. That idea that kind of thing would happen is just absolutely horrific. Or for it to be played up in such a way that two women who would have probably been friends under any other circumstances, but now one has a mask on and one does not. So now you're going to see one of these women now accuse the other one of trying to kill her family, and it starts a fist fight in a public place. These types of things. I recently finished a book by Yasha Monk. And one of the things that just stood out to me in that book is it's extraordinarily easy to make people hate each other when you can keep them divided. Anything that's happening within society today that does not promote bringing us back together, by default, is almost promoting a hateful divide between us. Yeah. Christianity, to me, should be all about, and has over the course of my experience, and one of the most beautiful things about Christianity is the fact that the togetherness, the bringing people together to celebrate our common faith in Jesus Christ. But the idea that there was some power that happened within this thing that started to fracture the Christian community, and people started to blame each other for killing you're trying to kill my grandmother, or you're trying to make my family sick, or this, that is probably one of the most painful things that I've ever seen in my entire lifetime, Walter. Just it's horrific.
we've described some of the challenges. We've explored some of the perspectives that enable us to look at others with empathy. As we enter into next seasons of our national life, of our community life, of our church life, what are one or two things that concern you? And then what is the perspective that you would urge us to have to cross divides?
Well, I think it begins with each of us. Some people will say, well, it's the politicians' fault. And in many ways, politicians have not helped the situation, that's for sure. But I don't see a solution coming from politicians. They're more divided than the country is. There's plenty of evidence for that. And if you're sort of waiting for somebody else to sort of step in and say, okay, let's all get together, we've already waited a while and it's not happening. I think it's to each of us, and particularly to us who are Christians, to recognize we have always been the ones who ran towards trouble and tried to solve it. We've always been the ones who, when people were battling with each other, trying to find a path forward towards an honorable peace, this is a great moment to try to do that again. So I would think each one of us, again, through whatever approach works for you, I will say Braver Angels has been an incredible learning experience for me. There's now many Braver Angels units all across the country. People can look that up and say, is there one near me? Let me get involved. If that's not a good fit, start with your church. Find, a person in your church who seems to have a different view than you do about public health issues, but who seems, until this all came along, like a reasonable person. Invite them for coffee and say, maybe the two of us could start to understand each other and could make a difference here. And then see if you can build that. Your pastor will thank you, because the pastors are probably not in a good position to do this either. Sometimes if they bring it up, that just seems to cause the church to get even more riven by all of the arguments and disagreements. It's up to all of us. And maybe that sounds like, oh, that's hopeless because we're so far apart. But I think at least 2/3 of the country, the exhausted middle, as they're sometimes called, are just kind of fed up with the way things are going. They don't buy into the extreme voices on the left and the right that are getting all the attention. And they sort of feel like, this isn't who we are. If we empowered them, they're the majority, they're us. And especially most of them are believers. We could do something to actually turn this around and get our country back. That's what I hope for.
Wilk, I want to give you the final word here of perspective as you look at the next season of life. What are some concerns, and what is it that you would encourage us to pursue?
Well, like my friend John Wood Jr. likes to say, polarization is the one problem that ensures all other problems won't be solved. And as we look to the future, I'll go back to saying, find, just like my friend Francis here said, find people that you don't necessarily agree with and have a conversation with them. Not necessarily with the idea that you're going to find common ground, and not necessarily with the intention to find some milquetoast middle, but to really expose yourself to different ideas than your own.
Right.
I cannot stress the importance of having a diverse group of voices in your life to not fall prey to the complete us versus them bubble. And I don't care if it's going back to one of the first things that we talked about in this conversation, Walter, and that's the rural versus the urban divide, or the elite, the intellectual elite or academic elite versus the blue collar working class guy from Minnesota, or your racial divides, or whatever the divide may be. Open your mind to different perspectives, and you will be amazed at how quickly your world will change. That us versus them mentality is not going to get the job done. So if we're looking towards the future to find a better way to move on as human beings, in the eyes of the world, I mean, each of us as individuals can make a huge difference. The we the people. It's we the people that will actually make this thing better. It's not going to be the media. It's not going to be the politicians. It's not going to be a group of academics on high that's going to get it done. It's the voices of all the people that will get it done. But we have to expose ourselves to people of unlike mindsets, or the job will not get done.
Yeah. It can't just be us versus them. It's got to be just all us.
Mm. You two have modeled this for us in our conversation. You've modeled a willingness to ask questions and to actually listen. You've modeled for us tenacity over time. Like you are doing this as a part of a growing friendship that you've been committed to, not just the one-off conversation that I can check off the box that I've done a little bit against polarization. You've committed to a further, deeper understanding and a growing friendship. And that is an incredible model for what it looks like to derate the hate, diffuse the tension, to build the bridges across divides, to enter into conversations that produce a greater compassion, empathy, and ultimately a community that builds a people together, without which we're not going to thrive as a society. Thank you. Thank you for modeling this, not only sharing insights. Thank you for the ways that you have actually lived it out for us.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Walter. It's been great chatting with you and my friend Wilk.